They laughed when a veteran and his aging dog inherited his grandfather's old cabin, a rundown place buried deep in the woods. No money, no comfort, just old debts and days no one was waiting for. Everyone said it wasn't worth keeping. But what he discovered after staying one night changed everything. A forgotten notebook, quiet acts of kindness, and a way of living his grandfather never explained, only lived. Stay with us. This is one story that will stay with you long after it ends. And before we begin, please help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your support truly means the world to us. Cold rain pressed down on the small town, turning the streets into dull mirrors under flickering amber lights. The air smelled of wet asphalt, cheap beer, and something unfinished, like a storm that refused to pass. Mike Anderson sat alone at the far end of the bar, his broad shoulders slightly hunched as if he were bracing for an impact no one else could see. At 46, he carried the kind of build that came from years of discipline rather than vanity. Solid, lean, with strength that no longer needed proving. His face was angular and worn, the sharp lines around his jaw softened by a short, uneven beard threaded with early gray. His dark hair was cropped short, practical, with no effort wasted on style. People often mistook his stillness for calm. They were wrong. Inside, Mike's mind was rarely quiet. It never had been since the war. The bar was loud enough to keep most thoughts at bay, but not loud enough to drown out the ones that mattered. A burst of laughter from a nearby table made his shoulders tighten. A glass shattered somewhere behind him, and his hand curled instinctively, knuckles whitening against the wood. Mike wasn't angry at the noise itself. He was angry at how easily it pulled him apart. Crowded spaces made his chest feel tight, his breath shallow, like his body was waiting for a command that never came. He took another slow sip of his beer, trying to stay anchored in the present, counting seconds between each breath the way a therapist had once taught him. Rex lay at Mike's feet, a large German shepherd with a graying muzzle and tired but alert amber eyes. At nearly 10 years old, Rex had the calm dignity of a dog who had seen enough to know when to stay still and when to move. His coat, once jet black and tan, had faded into softer shades, especially along his back and around his face. One ear stood perfectly upright, while the other tilted slightly, giving him an expression that looked permanently thoughtful. Rex did not sleep. He watched. Every shift in Mike's posture, every tightening muscle, every subtle change in breathing earned the dog's quiet attention. Rex had learned Mike's silences better than any human ever had. A man at the bar stumbled backward, bumping hard into Mike's shoulder. It wasn't a heavy hit, barely more than an accident, but it was enough. Mike's beer sloshed over the rim of the glass, spilling onto his hand. The man laughed, muttered something careless, and didn't apologize. Mike stood up too fast. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound sharp and metallic, slicing straight through his nerves. For a brief, terrifying moment, the bar wasn't a bar anymore. It was noise and threat and movement without meaning. His heart pounded violently, vision narrowing as his jaw clenched. Rex was on his feet instantly. The dog pressed his body firmly against Mike's leg, leaning his weight in, grounding him the only way he knew how. A low, warning rumble vibrated in Rex's chest, not aggressive, not loud, just enough to interrupt the moment before it tipped over the edge. Mike's fists were clenched, arms rigid, muscles coiled for a reaction he didn't want but couldn't always stop. He heard someone say, "Hey, man," in a tone that was half caution, half challenge. That was when Mike saw himself reflected in the dark mirror behind the bar, tense, wild-eyed, unfamiliar. Without saying a word, Mike grabbed his jacket and stepped away from the counter. Rex stayed close, shoulder brushing his calf as they moved toward the door. The bartender watched them go, but didn't say anything. In a town this small, people learned when not to ask questions. The door swung open, letting in a rush of cold rain and night air. Mike breathed it in deeply, the sting of it burning his lungs in a way that felt almost clean. Outside, the rain soaked through his jacket within seconds. Mike stood there under the flickering neon sign, chest heaving, hands trembling as the adrenaline slowly drained from his system. Rex sat in front of him, steady and patient, rain matting the fur along his back. Mike dropped to a crouch, resting his forearms on his knees, staring at the wet pavement. Shame settled heavy in his gut, familiar and exhausting. He hadn't hurt anyone, not tonight, but he had come close, too close. Mike reached out and pressed his palm against Rex's damp fur, feeling the solid warmth beneath. The dog leaned into the touch without hesitation. In that quiet moment, with the rain washing the night clean around them, Mike understood something he had been trying to ignore for years. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was deteriorating. And if he didn't change something, anything, this version of himself would eventually hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Rex lifted his head, meeting Mike's gaze with calm, unblinking trust. Mike swallowed hard, knowing this night could have ended very differently. Knowing, for the first time, that simply staying alive was no longer enough. The morning after the bar incident arrived quietly, as if the town itself were pretending nothing had happened. Mike Anderson woke on his couch with Rex pressed against his leg, the dog's steady breathing grounding him in a way sleep never quite could. His head throbbed, not from alcohol, but from the familiar weight of unfinished thoughts. He was halfway through making coffee when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Mike considered letting it go to voicemail, then answered anyway, his voice flat and guarded. The man on the other end introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, an estate attorney calling from a neighboring county. Brooks spoke in the calm, measured tone of someone used to delivering inconvenient truths. He was in his late 50s, Mike later imagined, the kind of man with thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a habit of smoothing things over with polite professionalism. Brooks explained that Henry Anderson, Mike's grandfather, had passed away 2 days earlier. The Yawash words landed without ceremony. Mike felt no rush of grief, only a distant tightening in his chest, like something being quietly rearranged inside him. He hadn't seen his grandfather in years. Their relationship had never been warm or hostile, just distant, built more on absence than conflict. Brooks continued, explaining that Henry had left behind a small property near Pine Creek, an old cabin that had been in the family for decades. The rest of the family, Brooks said carefully, had already declined the inheritance. Back taxes, structural issues, and the cabin's remote location made it more liability than asset. Mike listened in silence, one hand resting on the counter, the other loosely holding the phone. Rex watched him from the floor, ears tilted forward, sensing the shift in Mike's breathing. "There is a 7-day window," Brooks said, clearing his throat. "If no one accepts responsibility, the property will be turned over for auction to settle outstanding debts." Mike asked why Brooks was calling him. There was a pause on the line before the answer came. "You're the last next of kin who hasn't formally declined." Mike almost laughed. Of course he was. The man everyone else overlooked was suddenly the only option left. After the call ended, Mike sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. His grandfather's face came to him in fragments. A tall, thin man with a stooped posture, rough hands, and eyes that always seemed focused on something farther away than the room he was in. Henry had been quiet, not unkind, but never the sort of man who explained himself. Mike remembered long silences during childhood visits, the creak of old floorboards, the smell of wood and dust. No hugs, no lectures, just space. It was strange how that absence now felt heavier than any argument ever could. Mike called his aunt out of obligation more than hope. Margaret Lewis, his father's younger sister, answered with a tired sigh. She was a sharp-featured woman in her early 60s, practical to a fault, with short gray hair and a voice that left little room for sentiment. She confirmed what Brooks had said. No one wanted the cabin. "It's falling apart," she told him. "Henry never fixed anything properly. You'd be better off letting it go." She asked Mike what he planned to do. He didn't have an answer. When the call ended, the silence in the apartment felt louder than before. Mike spent the rest of the day pacing, wrestling with a decision that didn't feel like a choice at all. He didn't want the cabin. He didn't want the memories, the responsibility, or the questions it raised. But something about walking away sat wrong with him, a familiar discomfort he couldn't fully explain. Rex followed him from room to room, unhurried, as if this restless circling was something they were meant to do together. That evening, Mike packed a small duffel bag. Just the basics. No plans beyond the drive itself. Pine Creek was a few hours away, but it felt farther than that, like a place he had avoided without ever meaning to. As he locked the door behind him, Mike glanced down at Rex. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Ready. Mike exhaled slowly, accepting the truth he hadn't said out loud yet. He wasn't going because he wanted the cabin. He was going because, for once, not going felt worse. Mike reached Pine Creek long after sunset, the narrow road swallowed by trees that leaned inward as if guarding what lay ahead. The cabin appeared suddenly in the headlights, small, weather-beaten, and darker than the surrounding forest, its windows reflecting nothing back. When Mike cut the engine, the silence pressed in immediately. Rex jumped down from the truck with a stiffness that betrayed his age, his thick German Shepherd frame still powerful but slower than it once had been, breath fogging the air as he stood alert, ears high, scanning the tree line with quiet focus. Inside, the cabin was colder than Mike expected. The air smelled of old wood, damp stone, and disuse. He flicked the light switch out of habit, then scoffed softly at himself when nothing happened. No electricity, just as the lawyer had warned. The floorboards creaked under his boots, uneven and warped from years of neglect. Rex padded in behind him, nails clicking softly, tail low but steady. The dog moved, with confidence born of loyalty, not familiarity, choosing to stay close to Mike rather than explore. Mike dropped his bag and rubbed his hands together, already feeling the cold settle into his joints. The fireplace stood against the far wall, its iron door rusted and half misaligned. Mike crouched in front of it, inspecting the cracked mortar and soot-stained bricks. He had learned these small practical skills in the military, how to make do with what you had, how to keep things working when failure wasn't an option. His hands moved automatically, adjusting the damper, clearing out debris, stacking old logs he'd found by the door. Rex lay nearby, chin on his paws, eyes tracking every movement. When Mike finally struck a match and coaxed a weak flame to life, the heat was uneven, barely enough, but it was something. It felt earned. The night stretched on, long and restless. The fire sputtered more than it burned, forcing Mike to tend it constantly. Every sudden sound, the snap of wood, the wind rattling the windows, set his nerves on edge. Memories crept in, uninvited, sharp and disorienting, dragging him back to places he didn't want to revisit. His breathing grew shallow, chest tight, hands trembling as he stared into the fire. Rex rose and pressed his body firmly against Mike's side, solid and warm. Mike closed his eyes and leaned into the dog, grounding himself in the weight and reality of the moment. He whispered nothing. There was nothing left to say. By dawn, Mike hadn't slept at all. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was quiet again, but the silence felt different now, less hostile, more resigned. Pale light crept through the dusty windows, revealing the cabin's flaws more clearly. Peeling paint, a sagging ceiling beam, furniture worn smooth by time rather than care. Mike stood slowly, joints aching, exhaustion heavy but unfamiliar in its honesty. He stepped outside, breathing in the cold morning air, Rex following close, behind. For the first time in years, Mike realized something that unsettled him more than the night had. He had stayed. Through the cold, the panic, the temptation to leave, he had stayed. And as the sun rose over Pine Creek, Mike understood that this place had already begun to ask something of him, and that he hadn't turned away. Morning light revealed more than the cabin's cracked walls ever could. As Mike cleaned the small table near the window, he noticed a loose floorboard beneath it. Underneath sat a weathered notebook wrapped in oilcloth, its pages yellowed and dense with careful handwriting. It belonged to his grandfather, Henry. The entries were not personal reflections, but records, names, dates, short notes written with quiet precision. Rent covered, medical bill paid, winter supplies delivered. There was no explanation, no praise for himself, only a steady accounting of people helped and then left alone. Mike felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He wasn't looking at memories. He was looking at responsibility. The first name on the list still lived nearby, according to the address. Mike drove there with Rex riding silently beside him, the dog's gray-flecked muzzle resting near the window, eyes attentive but calm. The house was a narrow, aging duplex with peeling paint and a sagging porch. When the door opened, Thomas Keller stood there, a man in his early 50s with a broad, tired face, heavy stubble, and eyes that flicked quickly between Mike and the dog. Thomas had the posture of someone permanently braced for bad news, shoulders forward, jaw tight. Years earlier, an injury at the mill had ended his job and reshaped his temperament into something guarded and suspicious. Mike explained himself carefully, mentioning Henry's name, the notebook, the cabin. Thomas's expression hardened. He cut Mike off mid-sentence, accusing him of prying, of looking for leverage, of trying to dig up something better left buried. The door closed hard in Mike's face. A woman next door watched from her porch, arms crossed. Linda Harper, late 60s, thin and sharp-eyed, had lived long enough to mistrust anything unfamiliar. She didn't speak to Mike, but when Thomas's raised voice carried down the block, she retreated inside and made a call. Minutes later, a patrol car rolled up. Officer Mark Reynolds, mid-30s, clean-shaven with an even voice and a cautious professionalism, asked Mike what he was doing. Mike answered honestly, but honesty sounded thin and awkward out loud. The notebook stayed in his pocket. Rex sat perfectly still, trained patience radiating from him. After a brief check, Reynolds told Mike to move along. No charges, just a warning. Mike nodded, heat creeping up his neck, shame heavy and immediate. He left without arguing. The drive back to the cabin felt longer than the trip out. Mike parked, shut off the engine, and sat there gripping the steering wheel until his hands ached. He felt foolish for believing good intentions would be enough, for assuming his grandfather's quiet work could be stepped into without consequence. Rex shifted and pressed his shoulder against Mike's arm, grounding him. Inside the cabin, Mike set the notebook on the table and stared at it like it might accuse him next. He understood now that helping people wasn't a clean path. It carried risk, misunderstanding, and the chance of being turned away. As evening fell, Mike didn't tear out the page or cross off the name. He closed the notebook carefully. One door had closed, hard and final, and it left him with a truth he couldn't ignore. Doing good could cost him more than he was ready to give, and still, walking away felt worse. The second address in Henry's notebook led Mike down a gravel road lined with scrub pine and rusted mailboxes. The house sat back from the road, small and bowed by time, its roof patched in uneven sections like scars that never fully healed. Mike parked and stepped out with Rex at his side, the dog's gait slower now, hips stiff in the cold, but his posture still alert. The man who answered the door was Walter Green, a veteran in his late 70s with a narrow frame and a weathered face that seemed carved from old leather. His white hair lay thin against his scalp, his beard trimmed short but uneven, and his pale blue eyes held a sharp intelligence, dulled only by loneliness. Walter stood straight despite a tremor in his hands, pride holding him upright long after strength had faded. Walter recognized Henry's name immediately. He didn't smile, but his shoulders loosened, tension releasing in a way Mike almost missed. The roof leak was obvious once Mike climbed the ladder. Shingles curled upward like dry leaves, nails rusted through. Mike worked steadily, hands sure, muscles remembering what routine could calm. Rex waited below, tracking each movement, tail thumping softly against the dirt whenever Mike glanced down. Walter hovered nearby, offering tools he didn't need, conversation he wasn't used to having. He spoke about the war in fragments, not dates or places, just sensations, noise, waiting, the way silence could feel louder than gunfire. Mike listened without interrupting, surprised by how naturally the exchange unfolded. When the repair was finished, Mike reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He explained briefly, awkwardly, that Henry had left funds for situations like this. Walter stared at the envelope, then pushed it back with 2 fingers. His voice was steady but firm. He said money came and went. It always had. What Henry had given him wasn't cash. It was time. Someone who sat at the table and didn't rush, someone who stayed long enough for the house to feel less empty. Mike felt the words settle slowly, reshaping something he'd misunderstood. He folded the envelope and put it away, unsure why his chest felt tight. They sat on the porch as the afternoon cooled. Walter talked about rebuilding fences after storms, about the quiet dignity of fixing things that didn't thank you. Rex lay at Mike's feet, eyes half closed, content in the stillness. Mike realized he hadn't checked his phone once. He hadn't scanned the horizon for an exit. He was simply there. When he finally stood to leave, Walter gripped his hand longer than necessary, a gesture that carried more weight than words. "You're doing it the right way," Walter said. "Staying." The drive back to the cabin was quieter than usual. Mike didn't turn on the radio. At the cabin, he opened the notebook and wrote a single line beneath Walter's name. Roof repaired. Afternoon spent. He paused, then added nothing else. He didn't. He crossed the name out. He closed the book and sat at the table as dusk crept in, Rex settling beside him. Mike understood now that Henry's legacy wasn't measured in receipts or totals. It was measured in moments where someone chose not to leave. And for the first time since the war, Mike felt the faint outline of a purpose that didn't ask him to be fixed, only present. The letter arrived folded too neatly to be good news. Mike found it tucked beneath the cabin door after a morning spent fixing a loose hinge and reseating a warped step. The envelope bore the seal of a regional bank, the paper stiff and impersonal. Inside, the language was precise and cold: outstanding property taxes, accumulated penalties, a final notice. If the balance wasn't settled, the cabin would be seized and scheduled for auction. Mike read it twice, then sat down hard at the table. The room felt smaller, the air tighter. Rex padded over and rested his chin on Mike's knee, the dog's graying face calm, eyes steady, as if asking a question without words. Mike did the math on the back of the envelope. Selling the cabin would be the clean solution. It would erase the risk, the debt, the uncertainty. He could walk away with whatever remained and return to a life that, while narrow, was familiar. He stared at the notebook Henry had left behind, its corners softened by use. The choice wasn't abstract anymore. It pressed against him, demanded something. Outside, wind moved through the trees, a low, patient sound that reminded him of the nights he'd spent listening for danger. He folded the letter and set it aside, not ready to decide. He drove out that afternoon anyway, following another address from the notebook. The place belonged to Sarah Whitman, a woman in her early 40s with a tall, slender build and a posture shaped by years of carrying more than she could afford to drop. Her hair was a pale chestnut pulled into a loose knot, strands escaping to frame a face marked by sun and worry in equal measure. Sarah's skin was lightly freckled, her eyes quick and guarded. A recent layoff had tightened everything: money, patience, sleep, and it showed in the way she spoke carefully, as if each word cost something. Mike didn't offer money. He fixed a broken gate, replaced a latch, listened while she talked about nights spent calculating groceries. Rex sat nearby, tail sweeping the dirt, occasionally nudging Sarah's hand when her voice faltered. When Mike left, Sarah thanked him without asking why he'd come. That felt right. Over the next days, Mike kept going. Small repairs, long conversations. He stayed longer than he planned, learned to sit through silence without filling it. He helped Earl Simmons, a retired mechanic with oil-stained hands and a bent back, replace a cracked window pane. He carried firewood for Mabel Ortiz, a slight woman in her 70s whose hand shook but whose pride did not. None of them asked for receipts. None of them wanted speeches. They wanted respect. Rex aged a year in those days, it seemed, sleeping deeper, moving slower, but always rising when Mike did, always choosing the same place beside him. At night, Mike returned to the cabin and faced the letter again. The numbers didn't change, but something else did. He saw the cabin not as a structure to be saved or lost, but as a place that allowed him to keep his back turned toward nothing and no one. Henry hadn't left him a bill. He had left him a practice. Stay. Listen. Fix what you can. Don't disappear when it gets hard. Mike realized that selling the cabin wouldn't just end the debt. It would end the work before it had found its shape. He placed the letter beneath the notebook and closed both. The decision wasn't finished, but it was leaning. Rex shifted closer, a warm weight against Mike's leg. Mike rested his hand on the dog's head and felt, beneath the worry and the risk, a steadiness he hadn't known he could keep. The cabin stood quiet around them, flawed and vulnerable, and for the first time Mike understood that keeping it meant choosing a way to live that refused to look away. The cold returned without warning, sharp and deliberate, the kind that crept through the cabin walls and settled into bone. Mike had just finished feeding the fire when headlights cut across the trees outside. Rex lifted his head slowly, old joints stiff, ears angling forward. A knock followed, hesitant, uncertain, the sound of someone already prepared to be turned away. Mike stood still, heart tightening. No name in his grandfather's notebook matched this moment. No obligation pressed him forward. Only choice. When he opened the door, a family stood on the porch. Daniel Morales, early 30s, thin but wiry, with hollow cheeks and a face etched by exhaustion, held himself protectively between Mike and the others. His beard was patchy, hastily trimmed, and his dark eyes flicked constantly toward the trees. Beside him was Elena Morales, a woman a few years younger, petite and visibly cold, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, cheeks flushed raw from wind. She clutched a EC. Sleeping child Lucas, maybe 5, small and underdressed, breath shallow and uneven in the cold. They didn't ask for much, just a place to warm up, just for the night. Mike hesitated. The letter from the bank sat folded on the table behind him. Every rational part of him warned against this: liability, risk, the possibility of things going wrong. Rex stepped forward, tail low but steady, and sat beside Mike, looking up at him with quiet expectation. The moment stretched. Then Mike stepped aside. He didn't explain himself. He didn't need to. The family moved inside, gratitude muted by fatigue, relief settling in small, careful breaths. They sat near the fire, hands wrapped around chipped mugs. Daniel spoke softly, choosing his words as if he'd learned not to trust them. Work had dried up. The car had broken down miles back. Shelters were full. Elena barely spoke, but when she did, her voice carried a strength sharpened by necessity rather than confidence. Lucas slept through it all, curled against his mother, thumb tucked under his chin. Mike listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix anything. He stayed. Rex lay nearby, eyes half closed, rising once to nudge Lucas's foot with his nose before settling again. The night passed quietly. No panic, no memories clawing for control. When morning came, pale and reluctant, Mike helped Daniel check the truck, offered directions, shared what food he had. There was no ceremony when they left, no promise to repay what couldn't be measured. Elena pressed Mike's hand once, firm and grateful. That was enough. After they were gone, the cabin felt fuller than it ever had. Mike sat at the table and opened Henry's notebook one last time. The pages were worn, the ink faded but steady. He read a few entries, then closed it gently and set it aside. From his bag he pulled out a blank notebook, its spine stiff, its pages unmarked. He wrote the date at the top of the first page in his own uneven handwriting. No names yet, no plans. Just space. Rex rested his head against Mike's leg, warm and familiar. The ache in Mike's chest was still there. The memories hadn't disappeared, but they no longer dictated the shape of his days. Mike looked around the cabin, at the cracks, the repairs, the fire still burning low, and understood something simple and final. He wasn't here to complete his grandfather's work. He was here because he chose to be. And for the first time, staying felt like enough. Sometimes God doesn't change our lives by removing pain, but by giving us the strength to stay and love anyway. If this story spoke to you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. May God bless your heart, guide your days, and bring peace to every struggle you carry.